How many people here this morning like enthusiasm? Pretty much everybody likes enthusiasm, depending on the situation, maybe. But enthusiasm is a powerful engine. It'll get you to do things when other people won't do things. You'll commit to doing things with all your might. And it's been said that nothing great has ever been accomplished without enthusiasm. So it leaves you not mediocre. You kind of have a glow about you, a shine, and you kind of light up. And you smile and you sing and you shout out, and it kind of gets contagious with other people around you. You spring to life. You're the person that's walking down the street with a spring in your step. And it kind of sets you apart. You are just excited. You're enthusiastic. You want to do it. And so it also exudes confidence. It inspires others. It can get the lazy person to be a go-getter. It can get the pessimist to be an optimist. Enthusiasm is a very powerful engine. But it can be used in two different ways. I've been told often that when I go to do something, I always do it 110%. I'm enthusiastic and I want to get it done, and I go at it 110%. And that's probably true. I do that in everything. And the bad thing about it is I did it in my former life, not for good things, but for bad things. But I was very enthusiastic. But that can also change and be for good things. Jesus said in Luke chapter 10 and verse 27, he said, you ought to love your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your might. That sounds like enthusiasm, doesn't it? Paul, he persecuted the church. With enthusiasm. And when he met Jesus on the road, that all changed. Not his enthusiasm, but what he was enthusiastic about all changed. He was excited. And as we read our Bible, we kind of come across some people that were enthusiastic, and we come across some people that weren't so enthusiastic. And Israel was always on that roller coaster ride. And so there were some that were and some that weren't. But one of the people that stood out as enthusiastic for the Lord was King David. Why was that? Why was King David so enthusiastic for God when others all around him, his own family, weren't? Well, that's a $100 question. But I think we can find the answer in the 122nd Psalm. I want to look this morning at that psalm, and the title in my Bible says, "Let us go up to the house of the Lord." You read the first two verses, it says, "I was glad when they said to me, 'Let us go up to the house of the Lord.'" You could just see David brighten up. When he came back with the ark in 2 Samuel, they would go 6 paces and set it down and do a sacrifice, and he would dance to the Lord. He was excited to have the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord with them. That was the presence of God with them. And he was glad to have that. It brightened him up. It made him excited. And you can picture this. David standing, coming back from war, and he's standing on the hilltop across from Jerusalem. Probably that's now was called in Jesus' day the Olive Garden. And he's standing on that hill and he's looking at Jerusalem. And he's anticipating that when he gets to the gate, the people are all going to assemble and they're going to march in procession up to the temple. And why would they march up to the temple? because that was where the presence of God was. And they went there to worship and to sing praises, just like we are this morning. And he was so excited. It said he was glad. He said, I like it. Our feet have been standing within your gates, O Jerusalem. I mean, he's at the ready. He's not just kind of going on in mediocrity and kind of saying, well, if I have time, I'll go up to the house of the Lord. Or if I feel like it today, I'll go up to the house of the Lord. No, what he says is he's standing. He's ready. He can't wait to get there. Now, you've got to understand, when David comes over that hill, over that rise, and he sees Jerusalem, David had a magnificent palace to think about. A magnificent place where he lived. And he could have said, man, I can't wait to get home. I can't wait to get back in my palace. But that wasn't his attitude. His attitude was, I can't wait to get to the Lord, to be with the Lord. Because to get up to the house of the Lord. And he didn't wait just for himself, but he wanted it to be with all the people. David had a sense of understanding of who God was and why he had what he had. It was all because of God. And why he was amongst all those people was because of God, because they were God's people. And he desired to be there, and he was glad to be with them. And he was glad to go to the Lord. And so he says this in the psalm, in Psalm 122. He's standing there, and he's got this vision as he's coming up on Jerusalem that this is what's going to happen, because that's what always happened. He was ready for this. And then he says, Jerusalem, built as a city that is bound firmly together, to which the tribes go up, the tribes of the Lord, as was decreed for Israel, to give thanks to the name of the Lord, to give thanks to the name of the Lord. He starts looking at Jerusalem, and he's not admiring Jerusalem. He's admiring God, who built Jerusalem, who was the foundation of Jerusalem. You might say, not physically, but spiritually. He was the foundation of Jerusalem. He says, oh, you've stood so long, and you've stood so strong, and you've been built so solid. I mean, the palace, the fortress with all the walls around. But what David sees when he sees all of that was not the physical, not the walls that he had built with his hands, but he sees that all is coming from the favor of God. Think about that. In your life, when you look at the things you have, do you look out and say, man, look what I've got. I've got a big house and a fancy car or two in the driveway, and I've got this and I've got that. Or do you look at that and you say, wow, God is awesome? Because it's not wrong to have those things, as long as you understand that they all come about as a blessing of God. And so that's how David saw that. And so he says, I want to go up there and I want to just thank God. I want to sing my praises to him. And he says it's because of the testimony of Israel. He's talking about the Lord's will revealed to Israel. And he says, I want to go up and I want to thank God for that. I want to show him how grateful I am. You know, it's interesting. Paul says in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, he says, in everything, always give thanks to God. Pray to God, being thankful for how he's blessed you. He talks about always being thankful. And you know, we're in a world where the world we live in is about as thankless as it can get. Not quite. I may be picturing that a little bit doom and gloom. But people are really ungrateful for what they have in a lot of times. Instead of looking at your situation and thanking God and praising God, we look at it and we go, man, if I could only have this, and if I could only have that, and if I could only do this, and man, if I'd have had a break way back when, I'd have been an NHL player, and I'd have had all this money, and blah, blah, blah. And you can go on forever. Or you can stop, and you can say, God, you're awesome. Thank you for everything I have. And that's what David was saying. I want to go thank God for everything that He is and that He's done for us as a nation. You know, he comes in there, and Jerusalem was the capital of the nation of Israel. Not just the physical capital, but it was the spiritual capital. It was where God's sanctuary was. And he says the thrones of judgment are there. And what he's talking about, if you look, it says the thrones, plural, of judgment were set. The thrones of the house of David. God made a promise to David that his siblings, his seed, would rule on the throne forever. Now he's talking in view of Christ. But he's saying that they will rule forever. And David's looking at that and he's saying, wow, God is great. God's done that. Not David's great. David did that. But God is great. God's the one that did that. And we know, of course, that is the antitypical kingdom that Christ rules. That's what that's all about. And so David is praising God and he's thanking God for all of this. And then he says, pray for peace of Jerusalem. May they be secure who love you. Peace be within your walls and security within your towers. For my brothers and companions' sake, I will say, peace be within you. For the sake of the house of the Lord our God, I will seek your good. David says, pray for peace. And I don't think David's looking at Jerusalem and he's saying, well, the Philistines aren't here knocking our walls down, so I'm happy now. I don't think that's what David's looking at. It could be part of it. But did you know that the name Jerusalem means possession of peace? That's why it was called Jerusalem. It was God's possession of peace. And if we look at that and we understand that God is the foundation of peace, and I'm not talking turmoil in this world, I'm talking spiritual peace, then we start to see what David was seeing. You know, Jerusalem was built on two mountains, a Mount Zion and a Mount Moriah. It was on two mountains. And that's why Jerusalem was called the mountain of the Lord, Mount Zion. Because it was built on that hill. And it was the choosing of the Lord to have it built on that hill. And so he's looking at Jerusalem, and David's thinking in Hebrew, he's not thinking the city Jerusalem, he's thinking possession of peace. God's possession of peace. And he says, I pray that God's peace remain there. Now think about this. When we're united into Christ, we are brought into peace spiritually. We're united with God. We're no longer at war with God. We're not at odds with God anymore, but we're at peace with God because we've been made right by the blood of Christ. And that's what David's saying. I pray that that peace continues with Jerusalem. And he says, and I also pray for their security, because where the Lord dwells, you're secure if you're with him. You see, Israel experienced a lot of times that they were insecure. And their insecurity came because they committed idolatry or adultery and broke their covenant with God and forsook their God, went away from their God, and they experienced insecurity as another nation came and took them over. And David is praying that they wouldn't have to experience that, because if they stayed in the peace of God, they would have the security of God. It's interesting because if you relate that over to the church, when are you secure in God? Are you just secure when you feel good and you may have done something right? Or are you secure because you've been cleansed by the blood of Christ and you have His cleansing blood cleansing you, and you walk with the Lord even if you stumble? See, David prayed for security to be with Jerusalem. And then he said, and on top of all of that, I'm going to seek their good. Now that's how you're going to stay in peace. That's how you're going to have the security of God, is when you seek good. First, God and His kingdom, His righteousness, and then you seek that for all the people. It's interesting. Paul said in Colossians chapter 3 and verse 1, he said, think of things above, not on things of this world. If we're going to think about God, where do we have to be focused? On the things of this world or the things above? We have to be focused on the things above. And the reason David was so enthusiastic for God is because he was focused on God. He was focused on the things above, not on the physical Jerusalem, but the spiritual aspect of Jerusalem. 1 Thessalonians 5 and 15 says, do good for one another. And David understood that he had to seek good for all people. He understood that, because that's what God requires of you and I, of everyone, to seek good for everyone. And we ought to seek the peace and pursue it. 1 Peter 3 and 11. Seek the peace of God and pursue it. Have intercessory prayer for one another. Paul said, or David was saying, if you don't see this community as the community of God, and you're individualistic, it's not going to go well. Because we're the community of God. And we work together, and we need to be praying for one another. We need to be seeking one another's good. We need to be asking for the security and the peace of God for all of us, all the time. And you say, well, that's great. That was King David. And you know what? King David, he had it all. He lived in a palace. He could come and go as he pleased. He would go out and God was with him, and he would have his victories. And we think of David like that all the time, but we forget David was also a sinner. And he committed adultery, and he committed murder. And he didn't raise his family real well in a lot of situations. And all of these things. And we don't always look at that. But David's life, King David's life, was no better than ours. It was different, but it was no better. So we can't just say, well, that was easy for King David. It wasn't easy for him. Jesus said in Matthew 16, upon this rock, upon the confession that he is the Christ that Peter made, he said, upon that rock I will build my church. And Peter said later on, after spreading the gospel for a while in one of his letters, in the first letter, he said, you know what? That Jesus, he became a stumbling block to some and a rock of offense to some, But I want you to understand, it doesn't matter that he became that offense to some or a stumbling block to some. I want you to know that he is the chief cornerstone. He is the kingdom. He's the foundation of the kingdom. He is the kingdom. He is the church. And so Jesus today, as God lived in the temple in Israel, Jesus lives in his church. And if that's the case, I suspect that we should have the enthusiasm that David had to be part of the church, to be a functioning part of the church, wanting to be together, wanting to be thankful, wanting that peace and that security that come from Jesus. In Acts chapter 10 and in verse 36, it says, "For the word that he sent to Israel, as for the word that he sent to Israel, preaching good news of peace through Jesus Christ, he is Lord of all." You see, we have that peace, that security that David was rejoicing in. We have the same peace and security today to rejoice in. It's in the church. And the church isn't a house physically, but it is a spiritual house. And I would say, let us go up to the house of the Lord. Let us be enthusiastic about being part of that family. Paul said in Romans 5 that we were still sinners. Jesus died for us so that we could be redeemed, that we could have peace. That peace with God that so many people don't have. You know, it's interesting. When you talk about enthusiasm, Luke 8 talks about the sower and the seed, and how the seed fell on different soils, some rocky soil, some thorny soil, some really good soil, and some soil that was kind of there but then it didn't last. And he said, you know, the one that fell on the rocky soil, it sprung up really quick. He was really enthusiastic, and it just as quickly died. And there's nothing. That's not how we want to be. We want to be like the good soil, where it grows up, and it continues to grow, and it's exuberant, and it's enthusiastic, and we keep our focus on God. And I'm going to tell you this morning, King David was enthusiastic for the Lord because he had his focus on the Lord. And all too often we fall short of enthusiasm in the church because, or in our life, because we really don't have our focus on God. We're divided, or worse, we just put God as one thing that we focus on once in a while. Maybe on a Sunday morning, or maybe on a Thursday night of Bible study, or whatever, instead of focusing on God all the time. You see, when David was out fighting, God was on his mind. He kept his focus, and that's why David was enthusiastic. And so I say to you and I, to be enthusiastic for the Lord, let's keep our focus on him, because that's how we're going to keep it. If you're not there this morning, if you need help with that this morning, if you want encouragement with that, whatever you need this morning, we're here to help you. So we invite you to come while we stand and sing.
Sing the wondrous love of Jesus, sing his mercy and his grace. In the mansions bright and blessed, he'll prepare for us a place. When we all get to heaven, what a day of rejoicing that will be. When we all see Jesus, we'll sing and shout the victory. While we walk the pilgrim pathway, love will overspread the sky. But when traveling days are over, not a shadow, not a sigh. When we all get to heaven, what a day of rejoicing that will be. the victory. Let us then be true and faithful, trusting, serving every day. Just one glimpse of Him in glory will the toils of life repay. When we all get to heaven, what a day of rejoicing that will be.